to Teach, Learn, Share, a podcast that thoughtfully explores teaching and learning in higher education. I'm Margo Eckenberg.
And I'm Jasmine Padma. This podcast is brought to you by Teaching and Learning Services at McGill University. We're recording today from Montreal, Quebec, on unceded land, which has long served as a site of meeting and exchange among Indigenous peoples, including the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabe Nations. We honor their stewardship as we live and work on these lands. So today we have invited a very special guest back to the podcast who was with us for our very first episode of Teach, Learn, Share, Kira Smith. We're very grateful and excited to have her here with us again today.
Hi, I'm grateful to be here. Thank you for having me.
So in its inaugural mini-series, the Teach, Learn, Share podcast asked members within our McGill community to weigh in on the connection between assessment, learning, and student well-being. And the conversations in that first mini-series really centered on how to leverage learning-focused assessment practices to potentially improve student well-being. And we interviewed members from our community to learn about specific ways in which we can build a culture of learning that fosters and supports student mental health simultaneously. The ideas came directly from our interviewees in the episodes, many of whom had different roles at McGill. So we had undergraduate and graduate students as guests. We had an instructor, a senior equity advisor, and Kira, who spoke to her research on post-secondary instructors' engagement in student mental health by means of their assessment strategies. And for that first mini-series, we had 4 goals that we set out to develop and create. So we wanted to explain a culture shift in assessment to raise awareness and potentially jumpstart conversations on campus within the community. We wanted to share concrete strategies of assessment for learning that promotes healthier learning environments. We wanted to know whether or not the research on these topics resonated within our community. And we wanted to share direct experiences and testimonies about assessment and well-being. One of the goals of the first mini-series was to create, and the podcast in general, was to create a space to have these conversations that maybe weren't happening or were not happening widely, at least on campus at McGill. And among these was how assessment can impact student well-being for better or for worse. We're pleased to be able to continue that conversation today.
Yeah, I feel like this is really an opportunity to walk the talk a little because I do feel like with this bonus episode, we're giving ourselves the chance to explore a topic a little bit further, take it in different directions. And we're really happy to have Kira back on the show today. So I wanted to underline this idea that while it's really great to hear about strategies that promote learning that can make assessment less stressful for students. So maybe sharing expectations around how grades are earned or giving them repeated low stakes opportunities to practice. These are all great things for learning. But we have to recognize that there are also obstacles, and these can be both personal and institutional that really inhibit being able to carry out these strategies in a way that instructors might want to. And we touched on some of these obstacles, certainly in the 5 episodes of season 1, but it wasn't the focus. So we didn't explore them at all. We sort of made sure they were mentioned, but that was about it. And the idea then behind today's show is really to explore more fully some of the examples of those obstacles that surfaced in season 1. And we did want to underline that we won't be reviewing an exhaustive list of obstacles. We've chosen a few that surfaced on the Teach, Learn, Share episodes from our very first mini-series on assessment and well-being. So that's how we chose which obstacles to talk about. And then we have complemented them with different testimonies that we've heard from instructors at McGill University over the last year or so. And similarly, I also wanted to point out the fact that we won't assume to provide answers or solutions. Rather, we're looking to have an informed discussion around the obstacles that instructors face when wanting to promote assessment strategies that favor student well-being. And in so doing, we really hope to contribute to an important discussion both at McGill and at university campuses beyond McGill today.
We wanted to have Kira back on the podcast to help us navigate some of these conversations and some of the complexities and the obstacles that we're going to be talking about. So to introduce Kira a little bit more, Kira holds a Master's of Arts in Education from McGill. Her thesis focused on post-secondary instructor engagement in student mental health promotion, and it analyzed various supporting and assessment-related activities influenced by institutional policies. She provides recommendations for both McGill and other post-secondary institutions to enhance instructor involvement in mental health promotion. Now at the Office of Science Education, Kira supports student-facing initiatives, blending her interests in mental health promotion, institutional improvement, and empathetic, equitable, and sustainable teaching and learning. And I've had the pleasure of working alongside Kira for a few projects that involve TLS and O's collaboration. She's just very generally a wonderful person to work with, knowledgeable and well-spoken. So it's really great to have you back here, Kira. When we start talking about developing the ideas from the episode that we recorded last summer, you suggested we think more about the obstacles that instructors may experience to being able to promote well-being through assessment practices. So can you tell us a little bit about what prompted your thinking in this direction?
Thank you. Absolutely. And thanks so much for the kind introduction, and to you both for being so open to having these conversations. I'm definitely fortunate to be working with you, Margo and Jasmine, and then connecting with people who are here for the live recording, and then those who are listening. It's really a privilege. And thank you for the way that you've already framed today's discussion. I'm really looking forward to delving into these obstacles a bit further. And through my research, thanks so much for giving that summary. I really sought to understand what was helping and then also what was hindering instructors' abilities to engage in student mental health promotion. In these conversations, they were usually pretty hard and they were raw. And in my opinion, they were really important. So I'm grateful to be having the chance to be discussing them today. And they were important for a few reasons, in my opinion. First off, because naming obstacles could validate the real experiences of instructors that perhaps aren't often discussed. That's what I found through my research, that it was really a moment of validation for many of them. And then secondly, these conversations might allow us to really understand the reality of our context and then to build on the existing strengths and capacities that instructors have and that our university has. And really trying to be realistic about the work that we are asking people to do. All to say that I'm really happy to be here and I'm grateful to have this conversation. And I hope you two are similarly feeling excited. How are you two feeling about it?
I'm feeling really good. And thank you for asking. I greatly appreciate those two reasons that you highlighted to support having these conversations. I'm a big believer that the act of listening and validating can be very powerful. Sometimes, just feeling heard and understood and in an experience like this one, as you said, isn't often discussed and can be a very solid starting point for creating healthier learning environments. In this case, that's what we're aiming to do here today and with the conversations that we have on the podcast in general. I also think that grounding the literature and even some of the guidance that we offer at TLS to faculty in grounding it in reality is pretty crucial if we want to make any type of positive change. So addressing the obstacles like we are today opens up conversations that can happen at the institutional level. But I also feel like it informs our own work as educational developers in providing effective support to the community. So thanks so much for bringing that up.
It's really important to reassure our community that we are connected to that community. And as important it is to ground what we're doing in research and in the literature in terms of pedagogical recommendation, you have to always take the pulse of the community that you're in and see how people are feeling. And when there are obstacles, it's important that we have those in mind. And even something like implementing a new policy, which is my driving force, there are all kinds of obstacles that we have to deal with. So it's really important to recognize them and bring them to the forefront. And as you say, think of ways where perhaps we don't feel quite so impotent. We can think of ways as we work together, collaborate together in finding maybe not perfect solutions, but solutions that work and keep students learning at the center.
We'll get right into our first obstacle with that note. Often when we hear the terms, and I quote, healthy learning environments or mental health concerns in the discussions around assessment on university campuses, most of the conversations revolve around student well-being. And that's what the conversations really revolved around in our first mini-series. And there are really good reasons for that. We have discussed it with Kira in our first episode of season 1. What's less talked about is how instructor well-being may be affected by assessment practices. And it's becoming more and more clear that wellness or even mental health concerns are pretty pervasive throughout the academic system in general. So amongst students and amongst teaching and research faculty. And so I think it's important to acknowledge that we're all, even as staff in a field that greatly values high-level performance of its members at all times, which can be extremely tough and something that we don't openly talk about enough, in my opinion. So let's consider a first example here. Let's say an instructor wants to foster a classroom environment that supports healthier learning, supports student mental health and well-being, supports good assessment for learning practices, and so on. But they feel like their bandwidth is low, like they have no time, or they're burning out in the process. So Kira, could you walk us through some of the implications for a particular situation like this?
Absolutely. And thanks for raising this topic, Jasmine. I think many folks who are with us live and maybe listening have had these conversations before, whether about our own well-being, a colleague's well-being, or maybe about instructor well-being conceptually. And it's a great starting place for today's episode, because I think it needs to be very clearly stated as sort of a baseline that the well-being of instructors and academic staff is fundamental to everything that we do at the university and to the work of supporting student well-being specifically. So all of the strategies and approaches folks have suggested in season 1 and that we'll suggest today, they're not going to be helpful if instructors don't have the capacity to even get by. And we've known for a long time, so research conducted over the last three decades, that faculty members, even in comparison with other professions and helping professions as well, experience very high rates of mental health challenges, including occupational stress, depression, anxiety, and burnout. For example, a 2010 study showed that 24% of 1,500 surveyed Canadian academics experienced psychological strain or stress in the last year. So there are many reasons for the prevalence of these concerns, but many studies have shown how certain aspects of who we are and how we work. So for example, the career stage that we're at, the type of contract that we have, our workload, our gender, our race, how these are all connected to the way that academic staff experience well-being differently and have challenges to their well-being. And I don't want to be overly negative about this topic, because I do also believe that faculty can experience well-being, but it's really meant just not to trivialize this matter. And I think we've all heard a few metaphors like, you can't pour from an empty cup, or, make sure you put on your oxygen mask first, all relating to mental health and well-being. But the point is here that we understand that instructors will come to the work of promoting student well-being with different capacities to enact change of different magnitudes. So it's possible that some folks, it's just not going to be a priority at the moment. Maybe their own well-being is a priority, and that's okay. We'll meet folks where they're at. And hopefully knowing this and acknowledging this as our premise is how we move forward in a way that's really realistic. And I'm curious if you two, maybe Margo or Jasmine, have any suggestions for faculty who are experiencing challenges to their well-being, or maybe any experiences to relate here.
I think I wanted to mention the idea of community and reaching out to peers and having some structure, whether it be formal or informal. So McGill, for example, does have some structures like mentorship programs for more junior faculty, but there's often certain conditions for being able to access some of those resources or possibilities. Well, I think teaching and what's done at the higher ed level in general often tends to be quite isolating, and often instructors don't know what other people are doing or having similar experiences, and that by learning about what others are doing, be it through a small faculty community that doesn't necessarily have to be very organized, it could be a little informal, but at least it's a place to share both strategies about what's happening in the classroom and around assessment day, but also for larger topics like instructor well-being in general, as we're talking about, like what are the burdens and how are they playing out in different scenarios. So I'm going to ask another question now, Kira. It's another tricky one, but it is important, and I think it's really related to what we were just saying. And it has to do with the limits or lack thereof between an instructor's role and their responsibility. So, for example, how do we establish what an instructor's role is where students' well-being is concerned? And I've certainly heard this before. I think you have too, when I was talking to a group of instructors about assessment and well-being, and an instructor said to me, I'm not a psychologist. How could I address student well-being in my classes or in my assessment strategies? I don't feel comfortable doing that. So the question then is, how do we characterize the expectations of instructors in terms of the extent of their responsibilities? What do you think?
Yeah, you're definitely right that I've heard this one before. There are a few moments that immediately come to mind when you mentioned this. They're like burned in my brain of instructors sharing that they really didn't feel comfortable in a therapeutic role. And I'm totally on board with instructors not being psychologists or not being therapists. And yeah, that's a normal response. That's totally fair. And to be clear, yeah, I don't think anyone here does believe that instructors should be therapists to their students, even if they are trained. And setting boundaries, so actually saying I'm not a psychologist or I'm not comfortable playing this role is a really good thing to do with students. And the reason why this is so tricky, in my opinion, is that it's not written anywhere what instructors should or are expected to do with regard to student well-being. It's not part of the job description in some way. And that makes it really hard to know what we're supposed to do. And it leaves room for all of us to have our own perspective. Now, our collaborative care model at McGill, which I encourage folks to learn a little bit more about if they haven't heard that before, our collaborative care model with the hub and spoke model might suggest that it's everyone's job to support student well-being, including instructors and including students themselves, for that matter. But they should do so in different and appropriate ways. So some of these opportunities for instructors were discussed in season 1 of the podcast. And I encourage folks to take maybe a listen, if they haven't already, of season 1. And I want to mention that while instructors maybe shouldn't be therapists to students, it is possible that instructors will be in the position to encounter a student who's in distress. I think if folks have been teaching for long enough, it will probably have happened at least once, unfortunately. But in my experience, I've worked with instructors who have, let's say, been in an academic context, so say office hours, talking about an assessment, and then been very surprised by a student who then had an anxiety attack. So these things can arise even in an academic context, but we're not expecting. And a key McGill resource for instructors, if they haven't learned already, is the Helping Students in Difficulty folder, which outlines what to do and whom to contact in a crisis. And lastly, referring them to a resource really is the role of an instructor. That's really the most that we can ask you to do.
Another kind of obstacle that comes up all the time in my own position anyways, is one that involves logistics and infrastructure. So, for example, class size can limit the way in which an instructor can leverage certain assessment strategies to promote student well-being. Even the physical classroom can impact plans for certain teaching and learning strategies and so on. So we do recognize that logistical limitations can be an obstacle and a great source of frustration. We might not have the ability to control some of these variables, but I was wondering, Kira, if you could touch on the value in at least validating these concerns, and maybe we can chat about some of the resources and recommendations that we have at McGill to help support instructors in creating the best possible learning environments, regardless of the situation that may be present in terms of logistical obstacles.
Absolutely. I think it's so important to avoid these logistical concerns. And I really appreciate when I hear someone say, this won't work. It simply won't work for me in my specific context, because that is the reality. And there are class size challenges, TA support challenges, time constraints, educational technology challenges. And many of us don't have control over these things. I don't have control over these things myself. And sometimes the constraints that are placed on us, they're really terrible. They're completely difficult to work with, and there's not really much we can do. But still, rope me or rope us in, whomever it is who is your resource. Make it a you and me against the problem, or you and me against the obstacle kind of thing, because I like to think that necessity or constraint is really it's the mother of invention, as they say, but I like to think of it as a challenge. How can we work together to be inspired by the constraints that we have and find new solutions? And I love the idea that folks who work in teaching and learning are really of service to instructors to overcome these constraints. So for example, this is a little quick example that I once shared with an instructor. This was many years ago, that, knowing your student's name and pronouncing them properly was an important way to acknowledge their presence. And it was a great way also of making students feel part of a community. I mentioned that in the past, other instructors would also send a little email when a student missed class to check in with them and make them, really feel acknowledged and that their presence was valuable. And of course, everyone who's listening knows what the response will be. This is simply not feasible in a large class. If I'm in Leacock 132, there is no chance that I can do this. And that's okay. That's the reality check that I needed. So we sort of settled on an alternative, which was standing at the entrance of Leacock 132 and fist bumping or waving or shaking hands, whatever level of contact they were comfortable with students as they entered the classroom, and saying their name, hi, I'm so-and-so, and then inviting students to share back was their way of acknowledging the presence of students. And that is a really simple, maybe trite example of a way that we've sort of modified a strategy to fit. But the goal here really is that I want to make it very clear that the folks of us who work at the Office of Science Education, that work at Teaching and Learning Services, we're here to serve you. And it's our pleasure to connect with you and to sort out maybe how these strategies make sense for you in your context. So I'm wondering, Margo and Jasmine, if there are some strategies you want to share or resources.
I do have something to share. I what you just gave as an example reminded me of an instructor I was working with very, very recently. Something very similar that she does. She plays a song as students enter the classroom. So for example, the first day of class, she might be playing Bob Marley, everything's going to be all right type thing. And it's just for 4 or 5 minutes until students get settled. And I just really enjoyed that strategy that you can do in any class size and create a more welcoming environment and what have you. I also want to briefly plug our second mini-series of the podcast, where we do interview various faculty members in their teaching and learning strategies. And we tried to ensure in that mini-series that all of those strategies, those assessment strategies, can lend themselves to many different contexts. So a lot of the instructors that we did interview were instructors of large classes. And so it might be interesting to take a listen to that season as well, because they do have some very innovative and creative strategies that can be used in contexts that are sometimes otherwise viewed as obstacles.
I wanted to ask you about balancing concerns that instructors have with academic integrity and also academic rigor and standards with being fair to their students. So, for example, an instructor might want to accommodate students who are experiencing what we've been calling sort of mental unwellness, so students who are unwell. But at the same time, they're really concerned about giving all of their students similar opportunities to succeed at a given assessment task. So the question is, what's your recommendation to manage a situation like this? And I suppose a related point to this has to do with how instructors navigate this idea of how student success and student wellness is definitely a priority for universities currently. But sometimes there can be a little bit of mixed messaging where instructors aren't so sure where their priorities should lie. Should they be paying more attention to academic integrity and rigor? Or should they be worrying more about their students? Are these at odds with each other sometimes? So on occasion, balancing individual concerns with institutional ones can be an obstacle in of itself. Can you help walk us through that a little bit, Kira, please?
This is a difficult issue, and it's a common one. So I'm really glad we're discussing it. And before I get into maybe how these concerns can be navigated on an individual level for the individual instructor, I really want to reiterate sort of my stance on the role that institutions play in supporting us. So generally speaking, my work in this area, my research, has always sought to really highlight the great work of individuals and really to emphasize our individual agency. It would be disempowering and probably just straight up inaccurate to say that the individual person, individual instructor, can't or has no capacity to make good decisions about their unique context, about their course, let's say. And at the same time, our ability and our agency to make these good decisions doesn't negate the role that our institutions have to play in supporting and guiding us. So it doesn't necessarily responsibilize us. And I look forward to talking more about what our institutions do to support us in navigating these concerns. But looking first maybe at the individual role and how we might navigate maybe this perceived conflict. For me, this question immediately brings to mind the principle of equity. I think many of us share this. And rather than, let's say, giving all students the same opportunities to succeed, which many of us would perceive to be equality, it might help us to remember that students have different needs. They're experiencing different challenges, changing challenges, and they need different opportunities to succeed. So how might we do this? There are a lot of different approaches to this. Let's say supporting students for seeking accommodations, looking at strategies like a flexible assessment, integrating universal design for learning, UDL, and more, which I know were discussed in the podcast previously. But I think we need to maybe address the core of the obstacle, which is this idea we can only have maybe one or the other. It's rigor or it's student well-being. And we have to debate on it. And then we have to decide for ourselves and maybe for the university, which one prevails. And I like the idea that maybe there are ways in which we can actually address both, and maybe academic integrity and rigor actually support students' well-being. And I think there are many ways that this could be. One thing that comes to mind is clarity in assessment criteria, maybe in using rubrics, could allow students to best meet and exceed expectations so that your standards could be as high as ever. And I remember, Jasmine, you and Jordan talked about this in, I think it was episode 3 of season 1, in case listeners want to go back to that one. And I've been speaking quite broadly, but I'm wondering if this is maybe also an opportunity for folks to learn more about what we're doing at McGill and how our policy encapsulates both the principles of academic integrity and healthy learning environments. And I see this policy, PASL, I know maybe Margo, you'll talk more about it, as an example of how our institutions support and guide us and instructors in navigating sort of maybe issues around academic integrity and rigor and student well-being. And I'm wondering, maybe, Margo, if you want to speak more to that.
Sure, I'd be happy to. And I think it's an interesting initiative, too, because this is an assessment policy. So it's not coming out of efforts that are working towards student well-being. It's thinking about other areas of our university life where we can also have a concern for students' well-being and work to promote healthier teaching and learning environments. The policy that's been instituted at McGill is a principle-based policy. And I think in having a principle-based policy, we can move away a little bit from this sort of or dichotomy that we're talking about, whether academic rigor and integrity versus student well-being. And it's more of an and. Rigor, so the highest level of academic achievement, continues to be a principle in the new policy insofar as we want assessments really to ask the most of our students and really allow them to succeed, but really pushing in terms of academic rigor, high academic standards. But at the same time, there can be this concern for a healthier learning environment. And so how can we leverage assessments in such a way that we can promote both of those things? And I think by passing a university-wide policy is a way to try and emphasize certain practices. So you already mentioned this idea of clarity around instructor expectations, which allows students to have a clear sense of what they're supposed to do to be able to succeed in the assessment tasks concretely. And another one might be some flexibility given to instructors in terms of changing assessments after the course outline or syllabus has been distributed, which previously didn't happen in McGill. It was sort of written in stone what was on the syllabus. Now the idea would be that if instructors need to make a change, given their cohort, given the state of affairs, they can make a change, obviously in communication with their students and with an understanding amongst the class. But this kind of openness to flexibility is another way to sort of, I think, reaffirm a healthier learning environment without necessarily compromising academic rigor.
Thanks, Margo. I think it's very important that we touched on this topic of academic integrity and rigor, and that we're able to talk a little bit about our new policy that's coming into effect in the fall. It's something that many instructors are concerned about, and understandably so. So thank you, Kira, for your response on this. And I appreciate that you emphasize that we don't have to sacrifice rigor and integrity to ensure that our students are experiencing wellness and that we have healthier learning environments. We can have both. And that I think our listeners will appreciate that you both shared a few strategies to strike this balance. As we wrap up, I want to thank you so much, Kira, for being here with us once again. You are our very first guest on the show, and we're pleased to have you return, and I'm sure that our listeners are as well. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in. And remember to subscribe to Teach, Learn, Share and let others know about it. Until next time.